one more year without a parliament. Tunisia's President Kais Saied announces a constitutional reform referendum and extends the parliament's suspension for another year. Are these steps toward stabilizing the country or cementing his power? I'm Andrea Sankey, and today's Newsmaker is Tunisia's democratic struggle. Now, months after sacking the prime minister and disbanding parliament in a move widely seen as a coup, Tunisian President Kais Saied has announced a referendum on a new constitution. The vote is scheduled for July 25th, on the one-year anniversary of his seizure of power. Saied also called for 3 months of consultations before that constitutional referendum, and parliamentary elections are set to follow in December. That means Tunisia will remain without elected lawmakers for at least another year.
The parliament will remain suspended until the date of organizing new elections. The draft of the constitutional reforms and others will be presented to a referendum on July 25th, the date of the celebration of the anniversary of Republic Day. Legislative elections will be organized, God willing, according to the new electoral law on December the 17th, 2022.
Now, this Friday marks 11 years to the day since street vendor Mohamed Bouazizi set himself on fire to protest his mistreatment by the police and a dire economic situation. His last words were said to be, "How do you expect me to make a living?" Now, that sentiment resonated deeply with people, and his suicide sparked a wave of anger in Tunisia that spread across the region to become the Arab Spring. In 2011, millions rose up to topple Zine al-Abidine Ben Ali. But a decade after a democracy was established, some worry Tunisia is sliding back into dictatorship. President Kais Saied said he's trying to save the country, but opponents see him as merely concentrating power in his hands. Pro-democracy activists have called for recurring nationwide protests.
I focused on the fact that there will be elections on 17 December 2022. I think this is too far away. He's stalling. He wants to do what he has in mind. It's also a way to reassure the International Monetary Fund.
Are our conflicts going to revolve around the Constitution, articles, and others? The Constitution is not going to feed us. It's true that it's going to organize our future lives and the life of our society. It's going to build a state of law and institutions. But today, people are hungry and poor.
Now, Tunisia's president says constitutions are not eternal and claims a new legal framework is necessary. The current constitution is from 2014, seen as a compromise between the wishes of the Ennahda party and its rivals. It implemented a hybrid presidential parliamentary system. But many Tunisians say the system it created has failed, allowing for corruption and political roadblocks without resolving deep social and financial issues. Now, despite proposing constitutional reform, Kais Saied has been criticized for not having a feasible rescue plan for the country's economy and its public debt at around 90% of GDP. But on Tuesday, Tunisia announced that neighboring Algeria had agreed to a loan worth around $300 million. And Tunis has resumed talks with the IMF as it hopes for nearly $4 billion before the end of the year. But those bailout funds depend on the government imposing tough austerity measures. So, to discuss the latest developments in Tunisia, I'm joined now by Ahmed Gaaloul in Doha. He is Tunisia's former youth minister and currently an advisor to the leader of the Ennahda party, Rachid Ghannouchi. From London, we have Anthony Dworkin, a North Africa specialist and senior policy fellow at the European Council on Foreign Relations. And also in the British capital is Sami Hamdi, the editor-in-chief of the International Interest. He also voted for Kais Saied in a previous election. Thanks all so much for being with us. So, Kais Saied's announcement prolongs the concentration of power, but doesn't cement it if a proper election is held in a year's time. Ahmed Gaaloul, is that acceptable?
No, I don't think that it is acceptable, because all what Mr. Kais Saied is doing is outside the constitution, and he's just doing it by himself as one person, one voice, and one decision maker. So whatever will be the plan or the calendar cannot be accepted because this is not a democratic process.
Okay, but if he does step down, Ahmed, after 1 year and elections are held as promised, yes, it would be another year of frustration, I can imagine, especially from Ennahda's side, but would it at least give Tunisia a chance to recover its democracy? 1 year lost, but still you'd be back on track?
Yeah, first of all, it's not the issue of Ennahda only. This is a national issue. This is a national problem. So if even we forget about the existence of Ennahda, the issues of Tunisia will not be sorted out. And you cannot reach an aim or an end via a route which basically does not lead. So basically there is no trust and no hope that this way of managing public affairs, they cannot lead. I mean, we cannot reach democracy through the tools of dictatorship and despotism. These tools, they only lead to more despotism and more monopolization of power. So, I mean, it cannot lead, basically.
Okay, Anthony Dworkin.
So it's not about 1 month or 1 year.
Okay, Anthony Dworkin, no hope, no trust, and it can't be recovered. Is that true?
Well, ever since Kais Saied seized power last summer, a lot of people inside and outside the country have been calling for a return to some sort of roadmap that would lead back to, some sort of accountable democratic governance. Now we have a roadmap, but as the previous speaker said, this is a very lengthy roadmap. It's already been several months where Kais Saied is essentially ruling by himself. Now we're told that it'll last another year, which is really, an extremely long time. What's more, the entire process of supposedly reforming the constitution, drawing up the laws that will guide the forthcoming elections, this is all concentrated in Kais Saied's hands. There's no evidence that he's got any process for involving the rest of Tunisian political society in this process. And so I think, although obviously it's good in principle that we're moving back towards accountability, I think we have to be very skeptical about the degree of genuine accountability and democratic principles that seem to be implicit in the program that he's sketched out.
Okay. Sami Hamdi, are you any more optimistic than our other two panelists?
I think just to clarify, I never worked on any election campaign with Kais Saied, although I did vote for him in the second round when I was put between a rock and a hard place between Kais Saied and Nabil al-Qaroui. But I think it's important, if we want to understand what Kais Saied is doing, there are two things that are important to understand. The first is that his primary regional allies are the likes of Egypt, where Sisi rules, the likes of the UAE and the likes of Saudi Arabia, the anti-Arab Spring axis, the anti-democratic axis. And the reason I mention that is because what Kais Saied announced has parallels with what Sisi announced in 2013, 2014, after he overthrew the democratically elected president. Sisi altered the constitution. Sisi announced elections. Hamdin Sabahi participated in those elections, and that gave those elections legitimacy. Sisi won those elections, between quotation marks, and as a result, he managed to present this roadmap through which the international community were able to recognize his coup, able to recognize his presence, and the matter of the parliament, or the matter of the democratically elected president, or the matter of the Muslim Brotherhood, or the matter of the other political parties was sort of cast aside. So what we're seeing actually is Kais Saied now entrenching his coup and the concession on the part of the international community, which was always concerned more about the optics of this coup as opposed to its substance. Kais Saied now has officially dissolved the parliament after the EU and Washington were calling for it to be returned. And Washington today has said that we welcome this statement that has come from Kais Saied. Kais Saied has announced that he will unilaterally write the constitution. He will open up a website where people can participate electronically with suggestions, but he will come up with this constitution and it will be voted on in a referendum on 25th of July, essentially commemorating the date of this coup and then allying it to the revolution. So what we're seeing is the same thing that Sisi did in Egypt. legitimizing the coup through the optics of a democratic process that we are now talking about as some sort of roadmap, because the international community's priority here is not the democratic transition, it's security and stability. Saeed, clean up this mess and we'll recognize it.
Right. Anthony Dworkin, would you agree that this is just a copy-paste version of what Abdel Fattah al-Sisi did over in Egypt, or is that too simplistic?
Well, I think there are quite a few differences between the situation in Egypt and the situation in Tunisia. But clearly, there is an extraordinary degree of political centralization going on in what Kais Saied has underway. And in that sense, I think there is a resemblance to Egypt. So far, the president in Tunisia has said emphatically that he supports all the kind of civil rights that were granted by the revolution. Let's see if he maintains that. I mean, as other speakers have said, he clearly has kind of put the constitution, which was the ultimate guarantor of these rights, put it aside, and he's ruling by decree. So, you know, I think there's grounds for some concern. And then I think, you know, just to pick up on the previous speaker's characterization of what the European Union, what the United States want, I think, you know, I think there is support for returning Tunisia to a democratic path. We've seen some quite strong statements from the G7 and others along those lines. But I have to say, I was quite struck by the United States' response to President Saied's announcement yesterday, welcoming the return to a roadmap. I think, you know, although they emphasized that it was important to have an inclusive process, there's no indication that an inclusive process is planned. And therefore, I might have expected a somewhat more skeptical note.
Too early to give congratulations in that case. Let me ask you, though, Anthony, if President Saied is sincere about elections and potentially stepping down, tell me, what kind of political system does he want to leave behind? What will have changed?
Well, first of all, we should make clear that the elections he's promising in a year's time are legislative elections, not presidential elections. So I don't think that there's any anticipation that he will be stepping down in a year. But your question does go to an interesting point, which is, you know, Kais Saied, ever since he kind of came onto the political scene, has had these rather kind of marked and to some degrees sort of somewhat eccentric constitutional views. Essentially, he envisages something which removes lots of power and democratic accountability from the national parliament. And so there's a stronger president and then kind of direct democracy working at the local level. Some people have pointed out some similarities to the system that that Colonel Gaddafi had in Libya. You know, it's a kind of rather unprecedented political vision, which he seems to hold to quite strongly in a perhaps somewhat eccentric way. And so there's every, you know, indication that the proposals that come through in the constitution that he's going to write may be going in this direction. And it's something which really has, you know, very little international precedent. It's not clear that there's a lot of support or interest among the Tunisian people, or that even his political backers for this plan. But, you know, he holds to it quite strongly.
It's interesting you say.
I think a lot of people in
Interesting you say
in Tunisia, I think, are much more. Yeah, sorry. I'll leave
Go ahead. People in Tunisia are much more
concerned with economic and social issues. And the president seems very fixated on this constitutional reform.
Right. And it's interesting that you said the constitution that he is going to write. Let me ask Ahmed that. As for the constitutional referendum, who is actually supposed to draft this document? That is very important. Who's going to write it?
Yeah, I mean, let me just put one point before answering your question. It's not about how sincere Mr. Kais Saied will be, or about what are his intentions. It is really about what he is going to do and what he is actually doing. So he can be as sincere as he wants to. However, he is in a road which definitely leads to somewhere which is definitely known, that is more power, more monopolization of power, more destructions of all the institutions.
That's why we asked it. I asked it as a hypothetical because we really can't be sure.
I understand that. Right. Just that. But for your question, who is going to write this constitution? First of all, he doesn't have the right to start this process. And if there is anything to be written, I don't think that other than Mr. Kais Saied himself will be writing this constitution, because I don't know how this would happen. And a constitution, it is the supreme legal text that binds the citizens of the country. So a constitution needs to be written by those who represent the people of the country democratically. Nothing else but a parliament. Tunisia it took us 3 years to write that constitution. It is a consensual constitution. It has its weaknesses, and it is the duty of everyone to reform that constitution, not to someone who presents himself as the sole speaker of the high virtues of I don't know what. So Mr. Kais Saied, whatever are his capabilities, cannot take the burden of expressing the will of the people. It is up to the people to express their will through democratic means, which Mr. Kais Saied is not respecting at all.
Okay, Sami, first of all, do you think Tunisia actually does need a new constitution? And if it is indeed drafted by what is basically one man, would Tunisians ever just tolerate that? We've seen their uprising from 2011 onward and how it's transformed the country. Would they settle for this?
I think it's important, first of all, to note that I was against the constitution in 2014, and the party that I supported actually voted against this constitution. But I respected the will of the people, I respected the will of the parliament, and we accepted this constitution. And in 2014, that's now the constitution of the state, and that's something that should be respected in the spirit of democracy. And therefore, I think that when it comes to Kais Saied suspending the constitution or the like, it's a flagrant transgression against the will of the people, given that he chose to do it unilaterally instead of going through a referendum or via early elections. In terms of whether the Tunisians would support such a measure or not, it's important to note that Tunisians are not united today in their support of Kais Saied, but rather united in their hatred of the political elite, and their hatred of Al-Nahda, and their hatred of some of these other various different parties that has helped to facilitate the Kais Saied's rise. Let's remember that for the ordinary Tunisian, in 2011, he voted for Al-Nahda because he believed that they were religious people and they would bring about the prosperity of Umar al-Khattab and these other caliphs of the past. That didn't happen. In 2014, they went the other way. They went and voted Beji Qaid al-Sibsi, somebody who said, فَبِحَيْثُ تَحْيَا Tunis, Tunis will be revived, and I will rid the country of Al-Nahda. And then he found he didn't have enough votes to do it. In 2019, Tunisians punished the whole political elite and went and voted for an outsider. So the Tunisian says, I've had 3 elections with 3 different results. I didn't receive any genuine change. Nothing has happened in the past 10 years. So I'm ready to bring down the entire system because I have no job. I have no employment opportunities. I'm poor, no prospects. I'm trying to get on the first boat to cross the Mediterranean. And the world is saying that I have a true democratic process. That's where Saied's power lies. And the final point I want to make is this, Andrea, before I hand over. The point I want to make is this. Kais Saied himself is not just going after Al-Nahda, but the whole political system. He announced that he would tackle the third line in the reference to the trade unions who support the coup, who support the overthrow of the parliament, who support the suspension of the constitution, but the trade unions want to lead it, not Kais Saied. Kais Saied lambasted them and lambasted Tayar al-Demokrati and others who supported him as hypocrites, emphasizing that for Kais Saied, there's no such thing as an ally. He will dictate the next process. Everybody will obey. He now has 1 year to prepare his political party, 1 year to draw up new election laws. He will draw up his own election laws. And by the end of the year, people are waiting to see what the results will be. But this is why I gave the example of Egypt. Sisi did these elections. Political parties participate in those elections. Sisi came to power. The world recognized him. And we moved on from the democratic transition. And Sisi speaks at the UN. This is the reality. That's why there's not much difference between the Egypt and Tunisian experience in its substance.
Anthony, I want to move this a bit forward with you because right now there are others in Tunisia saying that the reason that Kais Saied is actually stalling or delaying any kind of election is in order to reassure the International Monetary Fund. I want to ask you about that. How so? And I mean, is pressure from the IMF perhaps inadvertently giving Kais Saied this longevity here?
I don't myself see any connection between the need to get out external funding for Tunisia and the delay in naming, a date for the legislative elections. I mean, what the IMF has wanted was to have a government in place that they can work with. And there is now a government, albeit one that's completely under the president's control. But I think, mentioning the IMF does bring in what I think is really a crucial factor here, which is the terrible economic and social conditions in Tunisia. And it was really the economic problems that exist in the country and that have persisted since the revolution that lie behind a lot of the loss of faith of the Tunisian people in the political elite that other speakers talked about. And I think some of the support, quite a lot of the support for Kais Saied's move was the sense that, democracy is not really delivering any tangible economic benefits. We need a sort of stronger figure to step in. But in a way, I think part of the irony of the situation is that Kais Saied himself seems to have no knowledge or indeed much interest in economic and social policy making. So yes, the government is back negotiating with the IMF, but it's not really clear that they have any kind of systematic plans to try and get the country's economy working better for the country's people.
Right.
And I think, in a way, this is the danger that Saied faces, is that, he may kind of believe strongly in this vision of a new constitution, but I think the people just want a government that's going to do better in terms of, remedying the hardships that they're facing.
Understood.
And I think if Saied fails to engage with that, he could find himself losing support quite quickly.
Okay, Ahmed, let me ask you, I want to move on to another issue and talk about Tunisia's neighbors and what kind of support or lack thereof Tunisia is actually getting from them. Algeria has agreed to this $300 million loan with Kais Saied. Is that unconditional, or is something expected in return? And does it worry you what roles and what influence neighboring countries might have with Kais Saied's government?
Well, first of all, we do welcome any help from which the Tunisian people will benefit, because we need to know that right now, this government, Mr. Kais Saied's government, has no money to pay salaries for next month. And the amount which they are going to get as a loan will basically cover maybe next month or part of the following month. So right now we are in a situation where we will need to borrow money each month just to pay salaries. And beside that, the negotiation with the IMF this government, Mr. Kais Saied's government, is asked to take a number of really painful decisions which are socially not accepted. So Mr. Kais Saied is leading the government and leading the country into a shaky path, which will definitely lead to social upheaval. And normally, for a country to go through such policies, it needs a lot of support, of political support, NGO support, and everything. So that's why he's not going to succeed.
Okay.
If Algeria helps Tunisia, just to give it a buffet of oxygen in French, just to breathe for 1 month, yes, it is welcome, because we do not want the Tunisian people to suffer from these failed policies which Mr. Kais Saied is following. And basically, it will just make the burdens on our country heavier and heavier.
Fair enough.
The existence of Algeria beside Tunisia is very important, because we were unlucky to have some of our regional countries from the Gulf bringing their agenda into our country. And it is better to have Algeria supporting Tunisia and the Tunisian people rather than having other countries who are far away from Tunisia and who only have their agenda to interfere and to attack our democracy. We do trust that Algeria is supporting our democracy, and we are happy that it is supporting right now the Tunisian people.
Fair enough, fair enough. You know what, we just have a minute and a half left. So Ahmed, let me finish with you, because this week, as we know, is the anniversary of Mohamed Bouazizi's death. He was, of course, the street vendor who sparked the Arab Spring. What are Tunisians saying and feeling about that anniversary this year? How much is it on their minds?
We need to know that Tunisians are in real state of fear. And that even that Mr. Kais Saied came up to tell them, I am the alternative. he is, he's put them right now in a worst case scenario. So Tunisians right now need to see an alternative to Mr. Kais Saied. On the 17th of this month, Friday, the streets will be full of people against Mr. Kais Saied. But the discussion will only be about politics. Like, nobody is going to speak about the social problems, the economic problems, and Tunisians do not need that. So I join what my colleague was saying. Right now, we need solutions for our everyday life. We need a democracy to deliver, and dictatorship cannot deliver. We will need stronger democracy. Right now, there is a front which is gathering itself of opposition to Mr. Kais Saied and to his policy. And the anniversary of this month will be quite a heated month, so that people will regain their democracy. But before that, and most importantly, we need to give a roadmap for the Tunisians, which will assure them that they will have bread on their tables.
Ahmed Gaaloul, I will have to give you the last word. Unfortunately, we're out of time. I'd like to thank you, Anthony Dworkin, and Sami Hamdi really so much for being with us on this edition of the Newsmakers. And to our viewers as well, remember you can follow us on Twitter @the_Newsmakers, and do be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel. I'm Andrea Sankey. I'll see you next time.